I like to define my field as all things ancient Israel. And then I subclassify that into language and literature, history and archaeology. I actually do mainly language and literature. My PhD was actually in Hebrew linguistics, and the history of the Hebrew language was my first field. But as an undergraduate, I had been an English major, so I always had this love of literature. And I found that I could do a nice fusion between the linguistic approach and the literary approach and the intersection between them as I study ancient texts, the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, texts written by the rabbis in the post-biblical period. But you always have to know the cultural context, and so I'm always mixing in the history and the archaeology, and you have to have broad horizons, so it's not just Israel per se, but the neighboring lands, Egypt, Canaan, Mesopotamia, even Greece across the Mediterranean, and that's how I envision the field that I teach. I have been to Qumran on a number of occasions. Qumran is the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and I love walking around there and exploring the area. There's always new things to be seen, even if there isn't any new excavation that has occurred. I don't pass myself off as an archaeologist at all. But I always bring that evidence to the classroom in particular. I do a lot of PowerPoint, use a lot of PowerPoint in my teaching, where you can really illustrate this and explain to the students what this particular pot means or what this particular inscription might mean, and correlate it and integrate it into biblical studies. My current book project is entitled How the Bible is Written. So I'm looking at what I would call the micro building blocks of biblical literature, the way language is used to create the literature of the Bible. I'm talking about things like alliteration, where the words sound alike. What I'm uncovering in my research is that a word that appears only once or twice in the Bible, which by definition means it's a very unusual usage, and these words just occur almost randomly in text from time to time. But what I'm finding is that they're not truly random, because they're invoked by the authors of these texts because they will alliterate with more common words that are in the neighborhood. The orality of the text is quite important, so alliteration will be a key factor to enhance the literary technique and to enhance actually the performance. The biblical authors have a fascination with what I would call repetition with variation. They repeat phrases a lot. There's a lot of repetition in the Bible. The person who's listening to this text in ancient Israel would have processed all of this in his mind, in his or her mind, who would have heard it and then hear it a little bit differently. We still have that experience when we go to the theater or watch a movie where it's all being processed orally, but imagine literature being done that way. And they would use whatever technique they could to bring out the pleasure of the text. They would use dialect differences to try to represent people from different parts of the land or even neighboring countries. So the neighboring countries didn't necessarily speak Hebrew. They would have been speaking Aramaic or some other language, but the text is in Hebrew. So if there's somebody from Aram who's visiting the land of Israel, he's speaking Hebrew, but it's tinged with Aramaic coloring. It's sort of like when we have an English movie and it's set in France. Well, the French characters are speaking English with a French accent, but they'll throw in an occasional French word to remind you that they're obviously speaking French, even though we're hearing it in English. So similarly, the writers of the Bible would use all of these techniques, many of which we're familiar with from our own, from later creative expression, but they're all to be found, they're already in the Bible. That's the current project, How the Bible is Written. I'm very excited about this project.